Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Ben, let's get to this Senate Intelligence Committee report. This thing just got dropped on us today. It's the Intel Committee's fifth and final report on Russian interference in the 2016 election, and it's a big one. It's 1,000 pages. It was bipartisan. Remember, the Senate Intelligence Committee is led by Republicans, so they had to work together on most of this. And it was focused on counterintelligence threats and vulnerabilities. So here are some conclusions that jumped out to me like early on. One, Putin ordered the hacking effort. It was extensive. It was designed to help Trump, hurt Clinton, and generally undermine the U.S. democratic process. We've known this for a while. This is new. The report describes Paul Manafort's employee of many years, Konstantin Kilimnik, as a Russian intelligence officer. That is far more definitive than the previous descriptions of him as having ties to Russian intelligence. And remember, this is a guy with a long-standing relationship with Paul Manafort. It describes Kilimnik as an integral part of his operations, of Manafort's operations in Ukraine and Russia. Remember that Manafort gave Kilimnik the Trump campaign's internal polling data, which is not normal. Talked to him about strategy. The report suggests that Kilimnik might be tied to the Russian military intelligence, or the GRU, their specific hacking efforts in this case. They talk about how Kilimnik later spread the idea that actually Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election and not Russia, so he was trying to cover up the crime. A couple of things. They found that WikiLeaks sought to join this Russian effort and likely knew exactly who they were helping. Here's a tantalizing detail, Ben. On the day of the infamous Access Hollywood tape that came out, Roger Stone got a tip it was coming. He called a right-wing lunatic who you're probably familiar with named Jerome Corsi. Jerome Corsi had a relationship with WikiLeaks. In that call, Stone told Corsi to have WikiLeaks release the Podesta emails that day. WikiLeaks broke them 30 minutes after the Access Hollywood tape broke. It seems very likely that decision was coordinated directly with Trump, or with his direct knowledge, because they talked that day, Stone and Trump. They also found that the Russian participants in the Trump Tower meeting had much more extensive and disconcerting contacts with the Russian government than previously known. It also criticizes the FBI for giving too much credence to the Steele dossier and not really adjusting their approach when parts of it began to unravel a little bit. And then finally, it says that Russian officials, intel services, others working with the Kremlin were able to exploit Trump's inexperienced transition team. So that's sort of after the fact. So Ben, this report it's timely and it's infuriating, right? Like timely because Russia is trying to do this again. Hopefully this wakes people up. We take it more seriously. But mostly I'm just so pissed because clearly there was collusion, coordination between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks, aka Russian intelligence. It seems very likely Trump knew about it. But all the key witnesses stonewalled. Some were later pardoned. Mueller failed to push hard enough for an in-person interview with Trump. Yeah. Barr was later able to spike the thing. So here we are. This is collusion, dead to rights in a bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee document. But seemingly the world has just moved on from this story.
Yeah, I mean, what this tells you, right, is the absolute worst case scenario of what you could have possibly imagined happened the day after our election in 2016 with respect to Russia and Trump happened. Because let's just step back. Russian intelligence was coordinating with the campaign manager for Donald Trump and a range of other associates around Donald Trump to help him get elected. And the specificity of that coordination wasn't just like the kind of thematic creation of social media content. It literally dealt with things like the fact that the WikiLeaks dump happened right after the Access Hollywood tape, the existential threat to Trump's campaign to create a diversion. Like that's a degree of coordination that, I mean, we used to debate collusion. Like we are now at a much more specific level here. And so the story is clear. Like Russia wanted Trump to win. Trump wanted to accept Russia's help. People around Trump, including his highest aides on his campaign, set up connections with Russian intelligence, and they ran the play, and it worked. And I don't, there's nothing more to it. It's an open and shut case. It's a layup, And I think what's so infuriating is that,
George Tenet might say it's a slam dunk, Ben. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's beyond a layup. And I mean, what's so infuriating is that we somehow allowed this whole thing to be so sidetracked for so many years with all these bullshit off ramps and Donald Trump yelling about text messages between FBI agents who were having an affair or something, or attacking Mueller and Mueller being silent. I mean, it just shows you like how much the democratic accountability in our system failed on this issue. And sure, it succeeded in getting this report out, but I almost had a question when reading this report of like, why are they just telling us this now? Like, how long have they known all these things? I mean, imagine how things would have been differently if these revelations were consistently put forward so that Trump couldn't just gaslight the whole thing.
Yeah, and like Richard Burr, Republican from North Carolina, best known these days for dumping a bunch of stock after he got a coronavirus briefing, led most of the work on this. He has stepped down from the committee. Marco Rubio took over. Rubio, the loser that he is out there spinning this as being about a win for Trump because of the Steele dossier. So it shows you how unserious the Republican Party is, and I think, frankly, that's why we're here. That's why we're here.
Yeah, no, and we're here on the doorstep of another election where you have to assume the Russians are doing the same thing, and we've taken no steps to protect ourselves. I think what it shows is, look, pretty amazing, Tommy, that we're sitting here having learned this level of detail about how the last president of the United States was elected in coordination with a Russian intelligence operation. And it's like the fourth biggest story after, the pandemic and the economy crashing, everything else. And that is what it is. But I think it demonstrates the need to come back at this from a view of accountability after we get rid of Trump.
Totally.
We cannot let this thing, just because people are tired of hearing about it, just because you think, maybe they talked about it too much on MSNBC and Twitter and all the rest of it, doesn't mean that there shouldn't be consequences for the fact that this happened. Yeah. And, and look, the fact that Roger Stone is right in the middle of this and he was pardoned by Donald Trump, talk about, somebody trying to engage in a cover-up. I mean, that's literally an act of obstructive justice. So I think this adds fuel to the necessity of there being some capacity, commission or otherwise, to look back at all this if Donald Trump is defeated.
Yeah, we either deal with this or it's going to happen again.
Exactly.
Let's talk about another election that Vladimir Putin is trying to control, this time in Belarus. So, Ben, it's pretty amazing. The people of Belarus are just refusing to go quietly as President Alexander Lukashenko tries to steal this election. We've talked about this the last couple of weeks. Lukashenko has led Belarus for 26 years. He's often called Europe's last dictator. This year, he faced a strong challenge from an opposition candidate named Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Lukashenko has a long history of rigging elections. But this year, observers were saying like the popular support was not behind him, not that it ever is. So when Lukashenko announced that he'd won the August 9th election with 80% of the vote, people took to the streets and they just haven't left yet. So on Sunday, there was a rally. It was called the largest in the country's history. Thousands have been arrested, many of whom said they were tortured. On Monday, Lukashenko visited a tractor plant, and according to the BBC, this was a quote from him, "We held the election until you kill me. There will be no other election." Great. Those workers booed him and they chanted, "Go away, go away," which is pretty amazing that they were shouting this guy down. But, Lukashenko might also not want to give them any ideas because they seem pretty bold. He sort of offered to hold a referendum on changes to the Constitution. I think everyone knows that's just a stalling tactic. So these protests are still growing. Workers are striking at state-run factories. Hundreds of state TV staff have walked off the job or resigned. Tikhanovskaya says she's ready to step in and prepare new elections. Ben, looming large in all of this is, the Belarus's shared border and weird partnership with Russia. There's a lot of speculation, including on Russian state TV, about whether Russia might send in troops. Though some analysts I read pointed out that it would probably be counterproductive because the opposition in Belarus is anti-Lukashenko, not anti-Russia. So something to consider. Our former colleague Mike McFaul wrote a piece the other day about what the U.S. and Europe should be doing. He's a former ambassador to Russia and mostly a democracy expert. So Mike argued that the U.S. and Europe should coordinate sanctions on Lukashenko and his government, call for the release of political prisoners, and threaten even greater sanctions if that doesn't happen. He suggests Pompeo offer to mediate, negotiate a transition, and that the U.S. and Europe should warn Putin publicly and privately not to intervene or else he'll face tougher sanctions. Ben, what do you make of McFaul's ideas? And how worried would you be if you were Lukashenko right now?
Well, I think if Lukashenko should be worried, and this is the reality of authoritarianism and totalitarianism, which is that these leaders seem inevitably entrenched until one day they just aren't. Yeah. When the fear factor is broken, these are not just protests. People are not going to work. People at state television are not going to work. The whole country is just fed up and they're decided to no longer be afraid. And things can change very fast in autocratic systems like that. We saw that happen with the collapse of a lot of the Soviet-backed governments in Eastern Europe, obviously, in the 80s and early 90s. And Putin knows that, right? I mean, that's what he's afraid of happening in Russia. This is a little different than Ukraine for a couple of reasons. Ukraine, part of what was at issue in Ukraine, part of what people were protesting about, is they wanted to take steps to draw closer to the EU.
Right.
Belarus is not doing that.
Yeah.
These people just want Lukashenko gone. There is no agreement for them to potentially join the EU. So there may be less incentive for Putin to stick himself in the middle of this and to frankly risk a backlash coming to him, like what came to Lukashenko, by rolling tanks in. On the other hand, he's done it before in both Georgia and Ukraine, so you have to take the threat seriously. But again, it's not like I think that it's not an obvious choice for Putin to do this. One of the things he's already seen is that in some of the protests in Russia that have been taking place, there have been people holding the flags of the Belarusian opposition. So there's a risk for this thing to go contagious into Russia as well. And so Putin may actually have an interest in just seeing some transition in Belarus that at least calms things down. I think in terms of the U.S., yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we should be united with the Europeans in imposing sanctions on Lukashenko, on essentially, declaring that we don't see Lukashenko as having legitimately won this election, and that we're on the side of the people in the streets. But again, we're not going to be the ones to shape this outcome. It should be the people of Belarus who shape the outcome. But we should make it unequivocally clear that we're on their side, and that we see Lukashenko as someone who's not legitimately won his election.
Yeah, I bet Putin is watching closely. Some protests have been happening in eastern Russia where I think he removed a popular governor and people are pissed about it. By the way, one way to, I think, get a better understanding of what's happening in Belarus and a lot of places, Ben, is to listen to your new podcast, Missing America. Today's episode is about the rise of nationalism. It is one of my favorite episodes. There's tons of David Lammy. Tell us more.
Well, no, it is directly tied to this because essentially we look at, okay, over the last decade, why has there been this rise in nationalism globally? But we look at it particularly through the prism of Europe, Brexit and Viktor Orban in Hungary and the Law and Justice Party in Poland. And what David walks us through is how right-wing leaders took advantage, I think, of this kind of crisis of people having a lack of a sense that government was working, a sense that the institutions of globalization and democracy had failed after the 2008 financial crisis, and just kind of a yearning in this 21st century world we're in for belonging, that the right wing took advantage of, that all these nationalists came along and they offered the oldest form of belonging there is. You're on this team and it's us versus them. It's us versus immigrants. It's us versus Muslims. It's us versus George Soros or what have you. And then we hear from some remarkable activists from Poland and from Hungary and from Switzerland, of all places, where they've successfully beat back right-wing nationalism, about the lessons that worked for them. And it is directly tied to Belarus because, Lukashenko's more entrenched, but he's running the same playbook, essentially, which is nationalism on top of authoritarianism. And the people in the streets, they're running the same playbook that these activists talk about, which is just mobilization and focusing on local issues that make a difference in people's lives and not succumbing to apathy. We're seeing it play out in Belarus. I really think we're potentially at a hinge point here where time is running out for these nationalists and autocrats. But, it's up to all of us to make sure, starting in our election here, that there's something else that can take their place.
Yeah. Listen, everyone check out Missing America. Subscribe today. It's one of my favorite episodes that's out today. So
I love this episode. This is definitely my one or two favorite episodes.
Ben, let's turn to Thailand, because that's also on the list of countries where protesters have taken to the streets. So according to the BBC, police in Bangkok say 10,000 people were part of an anti-government rally on Sunday in Thailand that lasted 8 hours and has been called the biggest protest in the country in 6 years. Their demands include 1, the prime minister's resignation, 2, a new constitution, 3, a new parliament, and then for the government to stop harassing dissenters, basically. The South China Morning Post detailed how protesters are using, like you said earlier, the Hong Kong protest playbook. Yeah. And they're doing this cool thing where they're throwing up the 3-finger salute from the Hunger Games to symbolize the reforms they want. So like they're taking this modern. They're also calling for reforms to Thailand's monarchy. And so here is why that is so risky. Yeah. In Thailand, criticizing the royal family will get you thrown in jail. And we're not talking about like a night in the slammer. We're talking about 3 to 15 years per charge. It's called the lèse majesté law. I think I said that right. It's been in place for 100 years. The Thai constitution says the king shall be enthroned in a position of revered worship and shall not be violated. No person shall expose the king to any sort of accusation or action. I don't know that would go over well for our friends in the UK, Ben. So the thing that's so pernicious about this is anyone can accuse anyone else of insulting the monarchy, and the police have to investigate the allegation. So you can get tossed in some long pre-trial detention for nothing. Not that it's acceptable to arrest you for doing something, but it's just easy to be abused. So the current prime minister came to power in a military coup in 2014. Since then, the number of these cases has more than doubled, even for online offenses like liking a Facebook post deemed offensive to the monarchy. One guy was threatened with 37 years in prison for insulting the king's dog, which seems crazy. Yeah. So protesters basically want the monarchy to be accountable to the elected government and the constitution. Thailand's economy is also struggling mightily. They dealt with the coronavirus well, but their tourism business just dropped to zero because of the disease. They're also angry about the dissolution of a pro-democracy political party in February. They believe the government may be responsible for a pro-democracy activist going missing in Cambodia, so that's pretty dark. Ben, given the stakes involved with these crazy laws in Thailand, it's already pretty remarkable to see these protesters out in the streets in the open like this. But, we also know that Thai security forces have crushed protests in 1973, 76, 1992, 2010. What do you remember from this coup in 2014? You were in the White House at the time. You've spent a ton of time in the region. Yeah. And do you have hope for these protest movements? So I hate to ask you to predict, but it's remarkable.
So I'll do a little bit of background here. So cool. Thai politics kind of got polarized because there was this populist guy, Thaksin, who got elected prime minister, who was, even though he's a really rich guy, had very broad support kind of in the countryside and outside of the traditional elite.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. And the military hated him, and kind of the established powers and the B in Bangkok hated him. And, he was taken out in a coup. His sister got elected. And so in 2014, his sister was prime minister, Yingluck, and they deposed her in a coup, and so it kind of polarized things. Now, throughout history, there have been coups in Thailand that usually lead to some return to democracy elections. That didn't really happen this time. Mm-hmm. The military took power and they basically kept it. So the first major element to keep in mind here is that you had a military coup that was never followed up by some return to democracy or some negotiation with the opposition. The people who took power just held it. The second thing that happened is the monarchy. So Thailand had this revered king for decades, a symbol of national unity. The kind of one thing that brought the Thai people together was their affinity for their king. His son was always seen as kind of this dilettante. I mean, this guy, you mentioned the dog, he made his dog a colonel in the Thai armed forces. He lived most of the time in Europe. He was kind of living the life of a right. jet set globally. And so he does not have the same attachment to the people. And the king died a couple of years ago. And so now you got a situation where the royal family is no longer the unifying symbol it used to be. And the military is not giving up power. And that's a pretty unstable mix, right? Yeah. So I think what we're seeing is the backlash to that. Like, wait a second here. The justification that the military-backed government uses is kind of the royal Thai government, but we don't have any sense that there's democratic legitimacy for this government, and we don't have the same feelings towards this guy that we did towards his father. And so I do think that there's long odds for these protesters in the immediate term that there's likely to be, a pretty brutal response from Thai security forces. But I think it's an indication that this is not going to go away in Thailand, that unless there's some, process to try to return towards democracy, that this is going to become a pressure cooker. And there's enough experience in Thai history of democracy that people aren't going to want to put up with that. And the Hong Kong piece is really interesting because one of the things I learned that you also hear about in Missing America is that across Southeast Asia, democracy activists are teaching Hong Kong tactics. And so we may see mass mobilizations in other parts of Southeast Asia as well.
Let's check back in real quick on Lebanon because things are getting worse, sadly. So we talked about this massive explosion that rocked Beirut earlier this month. I saw some subsequent reporting, Ben, from Reuters, where they talked to experts who estimated that The explosion was the equivalent of 200 to 300 tons of TNT. So that's how big this thing was. Killed hundreds, wounded thousands more, left hundreds of thousands homeless. Now, according to the Associated Press, coronavirus cases are spiking to record highs. This comes after, the explosion made 3 hospitals in Beirut unusable. So it's just an unbelievably awful situation for the people there. They're struggling to feed their families. There's massive political instability. So I just wanted to mention this so people were aware and say, again, like if you want to help out, check in with the Lebanese Red Cross. They're doing heroic work. That was who Liz Sly, the Washington Post Beirut bureau chief, recommended supporting.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to this, Tommy, is like part of what's happened is tens and tens of thousands of people have become homeless. And a lot of residences, apartments, houses have been destroyed. That's terrible news. The slight sliver of hope there is that if there is international assistance that can be put into reconstruction of homes and apartments, that might simultaneously create some jobs, create some work while putting people back in their homes. So hopefully there can be a well-funded, internationally supported, relatively straightforward rebuilding effort that both gets some people to work and gets some people back in their homes.
Yeah, agreed. Well put. So this report caught my eye, Ben. On Monday, CNN reported that U.S. intelligence believes that Iran has also been offering bounties to Taliban fighters if they target American or coalition troops in Afghanistan. The report said they found payments linked, the U.S. intelligence community found payments linked to 6 attacks in the last year alone. This is, again, separate from the bounties reportedly paid by Russia. In January, we all remember Trump ordered a drone strike on Qasim Solemani, the top Iranian general, because the administration claimed at the time he was planning imminent attacks on U.S. service members. The evidence for this imminent threat was thin and vague, and they basically walked it back when they had to report up to Congress. But even that conversation was focused on threats to U.S. personnel in Iraq, not in Afghanistan. So this report kind of caught me off guard. The CNN report makes it sound like no specific action was taken by the White House in response to these Iranian bounties because they were worried about screwing up the ongoing peace talks with the Taliban. Ben, the article specifically points to a major attack last December on Bagram Air Base by members of the Haqqani network as being one that was funded by Iran. I wondered if you could just tell people who the Haqqani network is real quick. And does this report surprise you? I mean, I feel like we've long heard about Iran providing certain types of weapons in Iraq or other places. I don't recall such specific reporting about Iran in Afghanistan. The bounty program seems pretty aggressive, but I mean, maybe this is just fairly standard for these IRGC creeps.
Yeah. So first of all, the Haqqani network, they're part of the kind of the Taliban front. They come from a tribal area on the border of Afghanistan and into Pakistan. And Haqqani is actually part of the tribal name there. And have been designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. Back when we were in office, among all of the different groups that kind of fought with the Taliban, the Haqqani network was particularly noted for engaging in these kind of attacks against U.S. forces into Kabul in particular, and essentially really the U.S. military saw them as one of the leading force protection threats in the country. In part because they had the safe haven in Pakistan as well. Now, so it's not a surprise that the Haqqani network would launch a complex attack against U.S. forces.
Yeah.
In terms of Iran, it's not particularly surprising. They've kind of played lots of different sides in Afghanistan. What they really want more than anything is to retain, this is on their border, they retain some leverage in Afghanistan, be able to work through proxies. Obviously, they want the U.S. out as well. So this is of a piece with the type of stuff Iran does, although more aggressive than anything that I remember. With us, it was more like they wanted to kind of maintain these ties, like the idea of just kind of direct bounties. I don't remember anything like that. So this would be an escalation from Iran. And by all accounts, Donald Trump did absolutely nothing, just like he did nothing with the Russian bounties. And part of what's so astonishing to me is just how much they were invested in this peace deal that they would look the other way. I mean, imagine being a U.S. We've got a bunch of troops in Afghanistan. How do they feel? Totally abandoned. Their commander-in-chief doing nothing, even though he's got reports sitting on his desk of Iranian and Russian bounties on their heads. that we also have reports were acted on. And this guy's doing nothing because of his precious peace deal with the Taliban. And never mind the fact of why are we even still in a peace deal with the Taliban if they're taking money from the Russians and the Iranians to kill American soldiers?
Yeah, I was trying to read between the lines on this one. I was like, is this an administration leak because they want to show yet another way that Iran is bad to justify future attacks on them? Maybe, but it also makes them look completely feckless and pathetic. Like you, look, we all want peace in Afghanistan, but like Donald Trump just wants to get out of there. He doesn't really care if they cut a deal. The idea that they wouldn't respond in some way to protect these U.S. troops if like there were 6 or 7 or maybe more attacks on U.S. personnel that were reimbursed by the Iranian regime is wild to me, especially just given the makeup of these like right-wing hawks when it comes to Iran. Ben, one quick follow-up I just want to do. So a couple weeks back, we talked about how the former king of Spain, King Juan Carlos, had announced he was leaving the country in the middle of this major corruption investigation into his activities. Spanish authorities are reportedly investigating whether a $100 million payment to Juan Carlos from Saudi Arabia was a kickback associated with the construction of a high-speed railway project by some Spanish firm in Saudi. So Juan Carlos abdicated the throne in 2014 after a separate corruption investigation. It means he's no longer immune to prosecution, hence getting the fuck out of there. Ben, guess where he is now living? Where is a corrupt king welcomed?
I mean, there's like the Seychelles, there's like Monaco, like...
Closer to home for this episode, the United Arab Emirates. The corrupt ex-king is reportedly close to the Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, who you will hear all about in our conversation with Rula Jibril. Are you surprised?
No, I'm not. And the Seychelles are, usually actually where the Emiratis like to vacation, right? So it's kind of it's close, but Dubai, Abu Dhabi, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. 2 more things. So this caught my eye because of the unbelievable pettiness that I think tells you a lot about the people who work in the White House. So according to a report in the Daily Beast, a bunch of White House senior staffers have grown increasingly frustrated with a guy named Matthew Pottinger. So he's the Trump Deputy National Security Advisor. Ben, are they mad about, the pandemic response being disaster? Are they mad about fraying relations with key allies? The fact that the world is laughing at us? No. They're mad at Pottinger because he decided to wear a mask early on in the pandemic, and they interpreted that as somehow an affront or a challenge to Trump, who was at the time shitting on masks, I guess. Quick reminder to all the idiots who are quoted in the story: masks protect the people around you, not the one wearing the mask. And Pottinger's boss, Robert O'Brien, got the coronavirus. But look, before you decide any of these people are good guys, know that Pottinger is also credited with lobbying to call COVID the China virus and is some, crazy extreme China hawk. So great people.
Well, but Pottinger's this guy who used to hear was like a normal, conventional kind of Republican
journalist,
guy who's become completely, I think, radicalized with anti-China fervor. But Tommy, it's like these guys are like the kids in high school who like took pride at failing the tests and like beat up the kid who did his homework or something. How petty. And these are the people sitting at the heart of the pandemic response, and they're hazing a guy for wearing a mask.
For being right.
What the hell? This is where we're at.
For criticizing the guy, talking smack about him to the press for correctly noting that the pandemic was going to be a big deal, taking steps to protect his colleagues. That gets you
such ridiculed. A loser wearing a mask. Oh my gosh.
Total loser. Okay, we're gonna take a break in a second, and we're gonna talk to Rula Jibril about this peace deal in quotes between Israel and the UAE that was mediated, negotiated, something by the United States. But before we get to the conversation with Rula, Ben, I just want to see if you had any thoughts before we really interview her on her thoughts, because we thought it was particularly important to talk to Rula today because there are no Palestinian voices being interviewed, quoted, acknowledged in these stories, and she is a Palestinian.
Yeah, I mean, here's the baseline of how I look at this deal, right? And I want to be clear, like normalization, Arab recognition of Israel is a good thing that people have wanted to see for a long time. That the idea that there are a bunch of Arab governments that reject Israel's right to exist, don't recognize Israel, that changing has been an objective that I think we can all share. Rula, I think, makes the point quite passionately that true normalization, it has to include people, not just governments. But beyond that, I think there's a couple of things I just wanted to say to unpack this deal. First of all, the UAE and Israel have been getting closer and closer and closer for a long time now. They basically coordinate in Washington. They talk to each other. There are all kinds of back channels, frankly, front channels, like people hanging out at Cafe Romano, the kind of heart of the DC establishment where this was negotiated. But I saw this, Tommy, as someone who lived through a lot of diplomacy with and around these countries. And I thought, okay, what are the motivations of these leaders? Because really nothing that much changes. We'll see there's a roadmap to open up embassies and that kind of stuff. That would be good. There's a discussion of direct flights. That would be good. But essentially, the UAE and Israel have already basically been aligned on a lot of stuff in the region, including kind of an anti-Iran front. So what is really happening here? Well, Bibi has got himself on a limb with annexation. He knows he can't do annexation right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. People in Israel aren't even focused on it. So he doesn't want to move forward. And so he climbs down from what he said he was going to do and gets something in return. And that's basically it, for Bibi. This is a win. Yeah. What is MBZ up to then? The Mohammed bin Zayed, and you'll hear Rula calling Mohammed MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the ruler of the UAE. Well, he knows that he's in a pickle if Joe Biden is elected president, because he's basically been front and center in promoting Mohammed bin Salman, who's chopped up a journalist. He's been front and center in the war in Yemen. The UAE's been a full partner with the Saudis on that until recently. He basically has been trashing Democrats, including our former boss, Barack Obama, very openly. So he needs to do something to buy some goodwill in Washington, to inoculate himself against and hedge against a Biden victory, or maybe to help Trump, his best buddy, get reelected. So that's what's in it for him, in addition to the reports coming out now that all this advanced weaponry can be sold to him now. The U.S. has not transferred certain advanced weapons to any Arab country because Israel has to have a certain military advantage in the region. We're waiving that now for them. So he gets arms, he gets a hedge if Biden wins, and he gets to do a favor for Trump in case Trump wins, obviously. And what doesn't happen here? The thing that grated me most about the kind of fawning coverage of this thing is, even if you say, okay, this is incrementally a step forward, another, albeit small, Arab country recognizes Israel, it was described as a, quote, historic peace agreement. Like, the UAE and Israel weren't in conflict, and the people that need to be a part of a peace agreement are the Palestinians. And that's what Donald Trump said himself he was going to assign Jared Kushner to do at the beginning of this administration. And the extent to which they have been totally wiped out and forgotten in this whole picture, I think just tells you this isn't about peace. This is about three leaders, Trump, Bibi, and Netanyahu, dealing with short-term political problems that they have by dressing this up as some massive historical Camp David style thing when it's just not that. And really you'll hear, I think, a very visceral frustration with it. But I mean, that's basically how I look at this thing.
Yeah, I share your frustration. There's a very Singapore summit vibe to a lot of the coverage, where there is a lot of credulous repetition of something being historic without a real effort to unpack the substance, because the substance isn't even finalized yet, nor is there really an effort to look under the hood at the broader sort of significance for the Palestinian people, what it might mean for the people of Yemen, if Saudi Arabia and the UAE are sold advanced drones, right? Like that, how is that going to stop the civil war that's been raging for years? It could lead to an end run around Congress for some of these arms sales. So look, so if people like this deal, if they think it makes Israel more secure, I'm totally here for those arguments. Thrilled to talk more in detail about it. We did want to talk to Rula today because there's just been zero Palestinian voices, and it's so important. And everyone needs to, why on earth would you believe promises made by Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu right before an election? Those are the last people you should just take on faith.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said it this way too, because I want to be very clear, right? It's not like this is the worst thing that's ever happened or anything.
No.
This could be a positive thing, right?
I'm happy to be wrong.
and you could believe that this is an incrementally positive step. Well, one more country recognizes Israel, but this is not what it's been presented as, this like massive thing. I mean, this isn't like Egypt negotiating peace with Egypt after fighting its neighbor, after fighting all these wars in the largest country in the Arab world, or Jordan, again, a neighbor that it had been fighting wars with. This is like people that they're kind of in business with behind the curtain, and they're just kind of opening the curtain and saying, yeah, the thing that everybody knows who's been working in diplomacy in the Middle East for the last decade plus, everybody knows that the Israelis and Emiratis coordinated on all manner of stuff. So they're basically coming public with that before an American election. Okay, but like it's just to give this kind of clean shot of it. This is somehow an historic peace agreement. I think, again, even if you think it's a positive step, and I think there are reasons you heard from Rula about why it might not be positive, right? And particularly what it does to the Palestinians. But to hype it like this is just kind of bizarre. And it was weird to see the American news media just kind of give Jared Kushner like a clean shot to do a victory lap.
Look,
I don't get it.
If you're comparing this to Egypt and Israel signing their regional peace deal in '79 or the Jordan peace treaty in 1994, you need to just read a book, dig a little deeper, because
take a cold shower.
Look, I think the press sometimes look, on paper the events seem big. You want to give Trump his due because you criticize him so much, but look, I just encourage everyone to listen to our interview because I think there's a lot more to this, especially for the Palestinian people. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have our conversation with Rula Jibril. Thanks again to Rula for joining the show. Ben, thanks again to you for doing this pod with no air conditioning, all your windows closed on a sweltering hot Los Angeles day.
Yeah, I'm officially hot over here. Like there's a sweat situation that is well suited to podcasting, Tommy.
Yes,
and not other forms. But it's really hot here in Los Angeles, and in our climate friendly house here we have no air conditioning, so we're paying the price for that. But
yeah,
I can't whine. Having you and I both lived in DC, where if you walk outside in the summer, you're drenched in sweat in about 30 seconds. Like 1 week where it cracks 90 degrees, and we've gone so soft that we freak out.
Totally soft. Although the difference is in DC, you are usually running to the metro in a Joseph A. Banks suit that
that's fair.
Traps heat like one of those silver blankets after you run a marathon. You just want to shoot yourself on the train.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, man. Thanks everybody listening. Talk to you all next week.
Talk to you later.